I was a baker fired for bad attitude, but what Marcus Hartwell didn't realize when he handed me that termination letter was that I'd spent 3 years documenting every health code violation in his precious Golden Crust bakery. The morning it happened, I stood in his cramped office above the shop floor, flour still dusting my apron from the pre-dawn shift. Hartwell sat behind his cheap particle board desk, his pudgy fingers drumming against a manila folder that contained my employment file. His beady eyes avoided mine as he slid the letter across the scratched surface. I picked up the paper and read the words that would change everything. Terminated for attitude problems and failure to maintain professional standards. 3 years of arriving at 4 a.m., of perfecting his grandmother's recipes, of covering shifts when his other bakers called in sick. 3 years reduced to corporate doublespeak about my alleged bad attitude. My jaw clenched as I folded the letter precisely in half. Hartwell's mouth moved in what I assumed were explanations or justifications, but I wasn't listening anymore. I was thinking about the rats. The rats that scurried through the basement storage area every night, leaving their droppings between the flour sacks. The rats that Hartwell knew about but refused to address because hiring an exterminator would eat into his profit margins. The rats whose presence I'd been meticulously photographing and documenting for months, initially thinking I might use the evidence to push for better working conditions. Now those photos would serve a different purpose entirely. I nodded at whatever Hartwell was saying and walked out of his office. Down in the kitchen, I gathered my personal items from my locker, a coffee mug, my knife roll, and most importantly, the small notebook where I'd been recording every violation I'd witnessed. The health department would find it very interesting reading. As I walked past the prep stations where I'd spent countless hours, I noticed things with fresh eyes. The walk-in cooler that ran 5 degrees too warm. The hand-washing station that had been broken for 2 weeks. The cutting boards that were cleaned with the same rags used to wipe down counters. The flour storage area where mouse droppings mixed freely with ingredients. Hartwell had made a critical error. He'd fired the one person who knew all his dirty secrets. I drove home in silence, my mind already shifting from wounded employee to strategic adversary. In my apartment, I spread everything across my kitchen table. Photos, notes, dates, temperatures, observations. 3 years of evidence laid out like a general's battle plan. The rat infestation was just the beginning. I had documentation of expired ingredients being relabeled with new dates, photos of moldy bread being scraped clean and sold as fresh, temperature logs showing the walk-in cooler failing consistently for months, evidence of Hartwell cutting corners on everything from sanitization to ingredient quality, all in service of his bottom line. But I couldn't just dump everything on the health department immediately. That would be sloppy, emotional revenge. This required precision. I spent the next week researching. I learned the health department's inspection protocols, their response times, their enforcement procedures. I discovered that anonymous tips could trigger surprise inspections within 24 to 48 hours if the allegations were serious enough. I found out which inspector covered Hartwell's district, a stern woman named Patricia Chen who had a reputation for zero tolerance. More importantly, I learned about the local food blogger scene. Golden Crust had recently been featured in a puff piece about artisanal bakeries in the city magazine. The article had brought in new customers and raised Hartwell's profile. The higher he climbed, the harder he would fall. I also researched Hartwell himself. His social media revealed an upcoming catering contract with the mayor's office for a series of political fundraisers. His LinkedIn showed he was actively courting investors for a second location. The man was riding high, completely unaware that his entire empire was built on a foundation of health code violations. Perfect. 2 weeks after my termination, I drove past Golden Crust during the morning rush. The line stretched out the door. Hartwell stood behind the counter, his face flushed with pride as customers praised his pastries. He wore a new apron, pristine white with Golden Crust embroidered in gold thread. Success suited him, made him careless and overconfident. I parked across the street and watched through my car window as the regular customers filed in and out. Mrs. Patterson, who bought her bridge club's weekly desserts there. The construction crew that stopped by every morning for coffee and donuts. The young mother who brought her toddler for fresh cookies. All of them unknowingly consuming products made in conditions that would make them sick if they knew the truth. My phone buzzed with a text from a former coworker still at Golden Crust. The message was brief but telling. Hartwell had just hired 2 new bakers at minimum wage to replace me and another experienced baker who had quit last week. He was cutting labor costs while expanding operations, stretching an already problematic system to its breaking point. The timing couldn't be better. That evening, I began phase 1 of my plan. I created an anonymous email account and sent a carefully worded tip to the health department. Nothing too detailed yet, just enough to get their attention. I reported concerns about pest control and food storage at Golden Crust Bakery, providing the address and optimal inspection times when violations would be most visible. The key was patience. I couldn't overwhelm them with information or seem like a disgruntled employee with an axe to grind. The evidence had to speak for itself. 3 days later, I watched from my car as a white sedan with government plates pulled up outside Golden Crust. Patricia Chen stepped out, clipboard in hand, and walked through the front door. I wished I could see Hartwell's face when she introduced herself. The inspection lasted 2 hours. I saw Chen emerge from the building 3 times to make phone calls, her expression growing more severe each time. When she finally left, Hartwell stood in his doorway looking pale and shaken, but he was still open. Whatever Chen had found wasn't enough to shut him down immediately. That night, I refined my strategy. The first inspection had likely identified surface-level problems, the obvious violations that any inspector would catch on a routine visit, but I had evidence of systematic issues that ran much deeper. Chen would need to see the pattern, the deliberate negligence, the repeated violations over time. I prepared a more comprehensive package, photos organized chronologically to show the progression of problems, temperature logs with dates and times, detailed notes about specific incidents of contamination and corner cutting, everything an inspector would need to build an airtight case. But I still held back on the rat infestation. That would be my nuclear option. The second anonymous tip went out a week later, this time with photographic evidence attached. I included shots of the malfunctioning cooler, the expired ingredients with altered dates, the unsanitary prep conditions. Each photo was time-stamped and location tagged to verify authenticity. I also added a crucial detail, the upcoming catering contract with the mayor's office. I suggested the health department might want to ensure Golden Crust met proper standards before serving political dignitaries. The response was swift. Chen returned 2 days later, this time with a colleague and testing equipment. They spent 4 hours at the bakery, taking samples and photographs. I watched customers turn away as the inspection dragged on, unwilling to wait for pastries while health officials crawled through the kitchen. When they left, Golden Crust's front door remained open, but barely. I could see Hartwell through the window, pacing behind the counter like a caged animal. The local food blogger I'd been monitoring posted an update that evening. She'd heard rumors about health department issues at Golden Crust and was investigating. The story was starting to get legs beyond just official channels. Perfect timing for phase 2. I waited until the weekend, when Golden Crust would be at its busiest. Saturday morning brought the usual crowd of families and weekend warriors looking for fresh bread and pastries. The line stretched halfway down the block. From my observation post across the street, I sent the final anonymous tip. This one contained everything: the rat infestation photos, detailed documentation of the pest control failures, evidence of rodent droppings in food storage areas. I included dates showing the problem had persisted for months while Hartwell continued serving customers. The email was clinical in its detail. No emotional language, no accusations, just facts, photos, and timestamps that painted an undeniable picture of a business owner who prioritized profits over public health. I sent copies to the health department, the food blogger, and for good measure, the local news station that covered health and safety stories. Then I sat back and waited for the explosion. It came Monday morning. I was drinking coffee in my apartment when my phone buzzed with a news alert. Health department shuts down popular bakery over rodent infestation. The story had gone live at 6 a.m., complete with some of my photos and quotes from Patricia Chen about the systematic violations discovered during recent inspections. I drove to Golden Crust an hour later. Yellow tape stretched across the entrance. A notice from the health department was taped to the door, declaring the establishment temporarily closed pending remediation of serious health code violations. Hartwell stood on the sidewalk outside, his face red with fury and panic. He held his phone pressed to his ear, gesturing wildly as he spoke to whoever was on the other end. Probably his lawyer, or maybe one of his investors trying to understand how their golden boy had fallen so far so fast. Customers gathered around the closure notice, reading in dismay about the rodent infestation and contamination issues. Several people took photos of the health department's findings posted in the window. Word was spreading organically now, beyond what any official report could achieve. I parked and walked closer, close enough to see the sweat beading on Hartwell's forehead as he ended his phone call. His eyes swept the gathering crowd, looking for someone to blame, someone to lash out at. When his gaze passed over me, there was no recognition, just the frantic desperation of a man watching his empire crumble. The beauty of it was how completely he'd been blindsided. In his arrogance, he'd never considered that firing me might have consequences beyond losing one employee. He'd never imagined that someone he dismissed as having a bad attitude might possess the knowledge and documentation to destroy him. But the real masterpiece was still unfolding. By noon, the food blogger had published her exposé. She'd connected the dots between the health violations and Golden Crust's recent media coverage, painting a picture of a business that had deceived both critics and customers about its standards. She'd also discovered the mayor's office catering contract and was raising questions about the vetting process for city vendors. The story exploded across social media. Photos of rats and contaminated ingredients spread from platform to platform. Reviews on Google and Yelp turned universally negative as customers realized they might have consumed contaminated food. The construction crew that had been daily customers posted a group photo of themselves holding antacid tablets with the caption, "Avoiding Golden Crust like the plague." Literally. Hartwell's pristine reputation was dissolving in real time. But I wasn't done. The systematic destruction of Golden Crust required one final phase. That afternoon, I made a call to the city's business licensing department. Not as an anonymous tipster this time, but as a concerned citizen asking about the process for reporting businesses that operated in violation of their permits. I learned that health code violations serious enough to trigger closure automatically triggered reviews of other permits and licenses. I also called the Better Business Bureau and the State Department of Agriculture. Each agency I contacted received copies of the same evidence I'd provided to the health department, along with suggestions about their areas of jurisdiction that might be affected. The goal wasn't just to close Golden Crust temporarily, it was to make reopening impossible. Over the next week, I watched the dominoes fall with surgical precision. The mayor's office canceled their catering contract and demanded a refund for the deposit. The investors Hartwell had been courting pulled out of discussions about a second location. The landlord for the proposed expansion site terminated their letter of intent, citing reputation concerns. Local restaurants that had been purchasing Golden Crust's wholesale bread quietly switched suppliers. The weekend farmers market where Hartwell had been selling pastries asked him not to return. Every revenue stream he'd cultivated over years of business was severing simultaneously. The food blogger followed up with a second story about how the Golden Crust situation revealed broader problems with health inspections and business oversight. She interviewed other restaurant owners about their practices and turned my targeted revenge into a wider investigation of the local food scene. Hartwell tried damage control. He hired a PR firm and attempted to frame the situation as a minor issue blown out of proportion by social media hysteria. He promised comprehensive remediation and claimed the violations were isolated incidents. But the evidence was too overwhelming, too systematic. Every statement his PR team released was immediately contradicted by new details emerging from the investigation. Photos of rat droppings in flour bins don't lie. Temperature logs showing months of food safety violations don't disappear. 2 weeks after the closure, I drove past the Golden Crust location one final time. The health department notices had been replaced by a for-lease sign. The windows were papered over. The golden lettering that had once spelled out Hartwell's pride was being scraped away by maintenance workers. I parked and walked to the front door, peering through a gap in the paper covering the windows. The interior was gutted. Display cases stood empty. The kitchen equipment was gone, probably sold to cover debts. Even the smell of fresh bread that had once wafted from the building was replaced by the chemical odor of industrial cleaning supplies. A movement in the back office caught my eye. Hartwell himself, alone in the empty bakery, boxing up the last of his personal items. His new apron was gone, replaced by a wrinkled t-shirt. His face had aged years in the past month, deep lines carved by stress and sleepless nights. He looked up and saw me watching through the window. For a moment, our eyes met through the glass. I saw recognition dawn in his expression, not of my face, but of the situation's cruel irony. The fired employee standing outside his destroyed business, surveying the ruins. I didn't smile or wave or make any gesture of triumph. I simply stood there, letting him see that I was present for his final moment in the empire he'd built and lost. After a long moment, I turned and walked back to my car. Behind me, I heard the sound of the Golden Crust door closing for the last time. The local business journal ran a small item the following week about Hartwell filing for bankruptcy. The article mentioned that he was seeking employment in food service, hoping to rebuild his career despite the recent setbacks. It noted that the Golden Crust closure had led to improved health inspections citywide and stricter enforcement of food safety regulations. I saved that article in the same folder where I kept my termination letter. 3 months later, I accepted a position as head baker at Artisan & Company, Golden Crust's former main competitor. The owner mentioned during my interview that she'd been impressed by my references and particularly by my attention to food safety protocols. She said the industry needed more people who took health standards seriously. On my first day, I wore a new apron embroidered with the Artisan & Company logo. It was clean, professional, and most importantly, it represented a workplace where quality wasn't compromised for profit margins. That morning, as I began the pre-dawn prep that I'd always loved, I thought about Hartwell somewhere across the city, possibly filling out job applications or explaining to potential employers why his last business had failed so spectacularly. I wondered if he'd learned anything from the experience, if he understood that treating employees as disposable had consequences beyond the immediate cost savings. I wondered if he'd connected his downfall to that morning in his office when he'd dismissed me with such casual arrogance. Probably not. Men like Hartwell rarely recognized their own role in their destruction. They blamed market forces, bad luck, unfair treatment by regulators. They never looked in the mirror and saw the architect of their own ruin. But I knew the truth. Every health violation I'd documented, every systematic corner he'd cut, every worker he'd undervalued, those choices had built the foundation for his empire's collapse. I'd simply provided the matches. As I shaped the day's first batch of bread, I felt the deep satisfaction of work done well in conditions that met every health standard. The ingredients were fresh, the equipment properly maintained, the workspace spotless. This was how a bakery should operate, with respect for the craft, the customers, and the people who made it all possible. The morning rush would begin in a few hours. Customers would line up for fresh pastries and coffee, trusting that what they received was made with care and integrity. That trust was sacred, something Hartwell had never understood, but I understood it perfectly. And unlike my former boss, I would never forget that behind every successful business are the workers who make it possible, people who deserve respect, fair treatment, and the security of knowing their employers won't sacrifice their livelihoods for a few dollars in savings. The bread emerged from the oven golden and perfect, filling the kitchen with the aroma that had drawn me to baking in the first place. I arranged the loaves in the display case, each one a small masterpiece of craftsmanship and care. Across town, the empty shell of Golden Crust sat awaiting its next tenant. But here, in this bright kitchen filled with the promise of another successful day, I had everything I needed. The bad attitude that had cost me my job at Golden Crust had become the righteous fury that brought down a corrupt business and elevated me to a position where I could practice my craft with integrity. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. It's building something better from the ashes of what came before.